A people without knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. We are the descendants of the men and women who suffered in these lands for 250 years under that barbarous, that brutal institution known as slavery. You who have not lost a trace of your history will recall the fact that over 300 years ago, your forebears were taken from the great continent of Africa and brought here for the purpose of using them as slaves. Without mercy, without any sympathy, the Europeans worked our forebears. They suffered, they bled, they died. But with their sufferings, with their blood, which they shed in their death, they had a hope that one day their prosperity would be free, and we are assembled here today as the children of their hope. Thus did the illustrious orator, journalist, and political activist Marcus Messiah Garvey declare unto the adoring masses of American men, women, and youths who ventured from the four corners of the nation to receive the great honor of witnessing him deliver one of his speeches on Emancipation Day at New York City's Liberty Hall. While the address itself, the principles of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, brought to the country's attention a host of incredibly controversial themes, such as racial justice, pride in the Negro's history, and black nationalism. It was nonetheless received with thunderous applause from the audience. The crowds who came to see Garvey speak were utterly astounded, hanging on to every word he had uttered. Many among the crowds were African Americans, grandsons and granddaughters of former slaves. Never before had they witnessed a black man speak so eloquently on behalf of the oppressed. The way he did, at least. He urged the sons and daughters of the African diaspora in the United States to rise up against state-sponsored discrimination, carry themselves with an unashamed pride in their noble black ancestry, and fulfill the redemption of the African homeland. When he spoke of these things, calling blacks in the Americas to reclaim their dignity and reject the racist notion that they were little more than human beasts with no history, he spoke as one with authority and fiery passion, determined to make the American dream an ideal that was arguably never intended to protect the rights of racial minorities work for them. Many of the orator's supporters took his words to heart. Also among these sons and daughters of the African diaspora were humble immigrants from the Caribbean nation of Jamaica. As a West Indian intellectual from St. Anne's Bay, a beautiful but poverty-stricken city situated on Jamaica's northern coast, Garvey was thought to have understood the plight of the Afro-Caribbean migrant particularly well. Aside from the blacks of America, it was the blacks of that island who were profoundly impacted by Garvey's work as a civil rights leader. Jamaicans have been serving as integral members of American society since 1619, when the first Caribbean migrants, many of them Jamaicans, arrived in Jamestown, Virginia, aboard Dutch ships as voluntary indentured workers. As every culture Jamaican American cites, the workers lived and worked as free persons, even when a Portuguese vessel arrived with the first shipload of enslaved blacks in 1629. Since Jamaica was a major way station and clearinghouse for slaves en route to North America, the history of Jamaican immigration in the United States is inseparably tied to slavery and post-emancipation migration. But between 1899 and 1964, several significant waves of Jamaican immigration into the United States occurred, seeking freedom from the poverty of the Third World and better economic opportunities for themselves and their families. Many immigrated to the land of opportunity as agricultural laborers, domestic service workers, and even specialists in the humanities. Making an alien and unfamiliar nation their own, they settled across the United States. A large proportion choosing New York City and South Florida as permanent residences. In 1916, Garvey joined the tens of millions of Jamaican immigrants who settled in New York neighborhoods like Harlem, East Flatbush, and Williamsbridge. After leaving Jamaica for London in 1960 to pursue his lofty ambitions of being a world-renowned writer, a young Marcus Garvey traveled back to the nation of his birth in 1914 to fulfill a dream he had held close to his heart since he was but a child: the redemption of the black race. When he witnessed how horribly the ruling white classes were persecuting the blacks of the West Indies and England, his soul was grieved. He became convinced that the African was a lamb surrounded by wolves, with oppressive systems of colonialism in Africa and Jim Crow in America seeking to subjugate them. It seemed as if the only way for the African American, as well as the Negro in the Caribbean, to be safe was to make an entire nation unto themselves, where they would be free from the shackles of racism and xenophobia. After Garvey founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, he tried with no avail to spread his nation of black nationalism to his countrymen. But as fate would have it, the activists' Pan-Africanist gospel gained significant traction in the United States. Poor and working-class blacks in the inner city came to be among Garvey's first supporters. Though most historians now consider the Back to Africa movement a failure, the spirit of that old campaign still lives on. Roughly a century ago, Marcus Garvey had a dream that cultural pride and unity would be promoted among all things within America's and the Caribbean's black communities. Many African American musicians, scholars, and civil servants have come to expound upon the ideologies of Garveyism. Caribbean intellectuals and artists of African descent have followed this trend, with 70s Jamaican reggae musician Bob Marley heavily incorporating Pan-African themes into his music. Perhaps it was fate or the providence of some divine power that stopped the mission of a sacred regathering of all people of African descent to their ancient homeland of Africa, where the sons and daughters of slaves would finally be able to live in their own sovereign state, free from the shackles of racism, reaching its fruition.